Okay, thanks for that, and welcome to this, our second debate today as part of the Battle of Ideas satellite event in Manchester. My name's Hilary Salt. Contrary to what Cheryl said earlier, I'm not to blame for Trump. That was a different Hillary entirely. I run a pensions consultancy here in Manchester, so I'm kind of well outside my comfort zone introducing a debate on identity politics. But I think we all have to accept that identity politics and the debate around them has become very interesting in the recent past. We have come a long way since Martin Luther King's dream that his children not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now every contribution to a debate seems to be required to have an introduction of as a woman, as a student, as a pensions actuary. There's a new one to throw in. I bet you don't hear that very often. And obviously, most notably this week, it has been that as a woman intro that's been part of the political landscape. So to try and sort out what's going on, we have a very esteemed panel to speak to you. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. And just so you know how this is going to work, because I know there are a few people frustrated by not being able to contribute to the last discussion, but hopefully we'll have a lot of time in this debate for you to, you can ask questions, you can make contributions, you can argue with what people have said, you can introduce new topics. We don't want to constrain the debate at all by saying it has to be a question. So I'm going to ask the speakers to all speak for a maximum of 7 or 8 minutes. And then we will come out to the floor and we have an hour and a half, so that means there's lots of time for you to contribute. I'll come back to the panel every now and again if they want to respond to anything that's been raised, or if they want to respond to anything their fellow panellists have said in their introductions. But hopefully we'll get quite a few rounds in of coming back to the audience and then back to the panel. So that's the choreography for the debate. So let me introduce the panel, and I say I'll introduce them in the order in which they're sitting, which is also the order in which they'll speak, so none of us get confused. So Kwame is going to speak first. He, I think, is known to many people around the room, so he kind of has home advantage. He's taking an MA at Manchester Met, studies multimedia journalism, and I think is fairly well known to many people as a student activist. So he's going to kind of set the scene for us. And then our second speaker is Ella Whelan, the away team for the purposes of today. Ella is the assistant editor of the online magazine Spiked. She's also a regular TV and radio commentator, a leading campaigner for Spike's Invoke Article 50 Now campaign. I'm sure that's lost half the audience, but that's the way we like it. She's also the convener of Spike's Free Speech University rankings and Down with Campus Censorship campaign. She's also, as well as all that, the author of a new book, What Women Want, Fund Freedom and an End to Feminism. And I believe she has some copies with her. Should anybody wish to purchase one, I brought mine so that she can sign it for me before she leaves us. Then our third speaker is Ian Parker, another man with home advantage to some extent, certainly. Activist, academic, revolutionary Marxist, psychoanalyst, author of masses of books, including a brand new one, Revolutionary Keywords for a New Left, which I have in my hand, but I understand is not actually being launched until the 10th of December. 11th of December, sorry, I was going to get my piece of paper, well done. 11th of December here in Manchester at Blackwell's. So people are entitled to come along to that if they wish to do so and hear more from Ian. Maybe it depends on whether they agree with anything that you say today, Ian. And then finally, we have Angela Nagle, who you've heard from already, those of you who were here for the first debate. I don't know, have you brought copies of your book, Angela? No, but you can buy it in all good bookstores, including Blackwell's. So we've heard from Angela already. We're going to let Angela speak first so that she can have a bit of a rest on the basis that she's already earned her supper here tonight. So without any further delay, I will pass over to Kwame.
Oh, thank you, Hilary. Good evening, guys. How are you guys doing, first and most? My name is Kwame Mensah, mentioned earlier. I'm really local. I went Trinity High School up the road, Loretto College as well, and I grew up right behind the City Ground. I don't even need to turn on the TV to know the scores. Um, yes, and presently I'm studying an MA in multimedia journalism. Prior to that, I was a sabbatical officer at MMU Students' Union, where I was representing students on the university's board of governors. But I was based at the Cheshire campus, which is more of a community-based campus over there, because I didn't want to stay too far away from Manchester. Who does really want to do that anyway? But great topic today regarding identity politics. During my time working with students hand in hand, and especially working across social media and things that I've observed as well, is that a lot of young people within higher education look for politics that identifies with them. And it's surpassed, when I talk about politics, it's surpassed the ideological stage. It's looking at the individuals within politics itself that identify with the people that they follow on social media specifically, because it seems like it's more or less where everybody's on social media. Who's not on social media here? In a way, we've stepped into a different world, a world of where we look at the politics of individuals rather than overall ideology or traditional politics itself. Just like, for example, the way Jeremy Corbyn has fantastically kind of taken advantage of that idea where people identify politics with individual more, where he has gone and spoken to music artists, photographers, and a lot of people who people connect with today. Like I saw an image of him and Stormzy together, like that's so significant. Like, what does that mean? Like, people would be like, oh, he's just a mute grime artist and a politician, but that means so much more to people, especially to young people. It means that the music that Stormzy is making, Corbyn must know something of that, so I can identify with that. So I want to know what politics Jeremy Corbyn's in if he's a politician, you know? So that's the interesting side where, that's the part really where a lot of young people that I've witnessed are really getting involved in, where politics is surrounding, and their identity surrounds other individuals rather than just the general ideological part of it. That's not 7 minutes yet, innit? But all right, that's fine for so far.
Thanks. Well, so the question is identity politics, a new culture war, and the word new struck me because actually I think most of us who have been tuned into politics will know that identity politics isn't necessarily anything new. The word intersectional feminism, or the phrase intersectional feminism, which is largely the same, or is kind of the precursor to identity politics as we know it today, was coined in the 80s, the late 80s, and that was about the idea that within feminism, different women would have different feminisms. A black woman would have a different feminism to a white woman, the same with gay or straight. I think that's kind of a crude summing up of it, but the idea of identity politics, of politics being to do intrinsically with your identity, the personal is political, that's nothing new. So it's not that we have a new phenomenon in our hands with, I think, not to put it too strongly, today's obsession with identity politics, but it is that it's turned up a gear. I think that especially in the last 10 years, most of the political conversation has been centered around identity and identity politics. Conversations about racism have turned into the intrinsic of race identity. Conversations about women's liberation and freedom movements have become centered around what it is to be a woman. The same with much of the gay liberation movements that came out in the 80s. They really kind of channeled down into a focus on identity, and I think that now certainly most of us will probably identify identity politics with the younger generation, as we see it, kind of to crudely stereotype it. Students on campus talking about the fact that they are, as a black trans student or as a white cis woman, that's the kind of thing you get heard said, and that is new, you know, that kind of level of obsession with it. And I'm going to come straight out and say that I really think it's a problem today, actually. I think that the obsession with identity politics has meant that we have a more introspective, more shallow politics than ever before, really. I think that the obsession with identity is an interesting one, because of course identity is important to all of us. It is extremely important to me sometimes that I'm a woman. Sometimes it's extremely important to me that I'm second generation Irish. Sometimes it's extremely important I'm from London. But the point is, I think that all of those things can be put to one side when I'm talking about politics, when I'm trying to reach out to what I see as a universal idea, when I'm trying to talk to someone who looks and sounds completely different to me. Then maybe the attributes of my identity wouldn't matter. And I think the problem is that identity politics today and the idea that where you were born, what you look like, what you got in your pants, what gender you are, that would be intrinsic to your political point of view. For example, my editor, Brendan O'Neill, who for as long as he's been in politics has been extremely pro-choice and pro the decriminalisation of abortion, was banned from making that argument at Oxford on the basis that he was a man because he didn't have a uterus. So that's a really good example of where identity, in terms of his identity as a man, got in the way of him making a political argument. And you can see that really strongly, I think, just to kind of give a topical example, with what's happening with the Me Too campaign. As Hilary mentioned, as a woman, I don't think I've heard as a woman as much as I have in the last month. Women have been, and feminists, contemporary feminists, have been coming out and claiming the conversation about sexual harassment on the basis of identity. Now, obviously, much of what's been talked about is in relation to women, so there's some truth to that. But I think what it's shifted into is a focus on this is intrinsically a woman's battle, only women can talk about it. And really, what's the end point of that? I mean, it's quite a dystopian end point. It means that we can't express genuine solidarity. We can't reach across what we were born with and transcend the barriers, you know, that we were born with in many ways, and reach out to each other politically. I think that's extremely negative. And so while we need to recognize that while identity is important, identity politics is a new culture war, and I think it's one that we're sorely losing, those of us who actually believe in freedom, democracy, transcending our, the barriers of who we are in terms of what we were born with, and moving beyond to some kind of universal idea. And that might sound very abstract and airy-fairy, but I think it's an argument that isn't being made very much today. I know it's quite a controversial thing to say that identity politics is a problem, when actually I think that a much more progressive thing is to say that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you were born or what you look like, it matters what you say and what you do.
Okay, I'm sorry I wasn't at the conversation earlier. Because Angela has written a very interesting book which raises lots of important issues. And I think it's quite interesting that that Angela is being framed in some way in this second discussion around the question of identity, when there's actually very little about identity in Angela's book. What Angela does do, which I think is really important, is draw attention to new social media and the way in which our political communication today is increasingly being framed around questions of identity, precisely because we're participating in media platforms like Facebook, where it's premised on the basis of our identity. It's premised on the basis of our profile and the way that we like and dislike other kinds of things, and drawing together different groups of people on the basis of those shared likes and so on. And I think we really need to focus on that phenomenon, the phenomenon of new social media, and the way that that provokes a certain kind of intense, pernicious personalization of politics, so that everything becomes rooted in the personality of the person, of the one who's speaking. Accumulation of identities in that kind of way. So I think, yes, at some level there is a kind of problem that we need to tackle, but we need to locate the problem where it is, not in identity politics as such, but in the phenomenon of new social media and what kind of communication that invites us into and encourages us to think about as we're thinking about our politics. I couldn't be here earlier because I was at a meeting in London, a meeting of psychoanalysts. I work as a psychoanalyst, and I suppose if you were to ask, where is this rampant identity politics that everyone is worried about supposed to be? I suppose you should see it in some way connected with therapeutic politics, with therapeutic discourse, with the clinic, with that kind of thing. And I suppose it's not surprising that some of the people who are so obsessed with identity politics are also against therapeutic discourse, against safe spaces, against the attention to feelings in political discourse. But actually, something has been happening in psychoanalysis over the last decades, which is really significant, which has been a shift away from shoring up identity, identity mechanisms, defense mechanisms, the ego, and so on and so forth, to a deconstruction of identity, to encouraging people to think about how they have become trapped in a certain kind of self, how they become trapped in a certain kind of body which is defined in a certain kind of way. And while there are mainstream kinds of psychoanalysis which are still focused on the nuclear family and traditional heterosexual gender relations between the father and the mother, and that's the basis of stable gender identity, and the corresponding pathologization of gay experience. Most psychoanalysis today is shifting towards a deconstruction of identity. It's that deconstructive spirit which is in tune with cultural processes. Yes, it's true, some people are fixated on identity, but there is a countervailing trend which is also very important in the kinds of psychologization that are happening in general culture, which is about relationships, which is about groups of people getting together. It's not about identity. In fact, there's a questioning of identity in much contemporary political practice. And if you think, for example, of protests that have been happening in the last week in Manchester, I was involved in protests against the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which laid the basis for the formation of the Israeli state and the dispossession of the Palestinians. And if you can think about that Balfour Declaration as being an opportunity for anti-Semites in 1917 in Britain to be very concerned with identity, with identifying Jews that they wanted to keep out of Britain and to encourage them to go to Palestine instead and eventually settle there in the state of Israel. There's nothing new, as Ella said. There's nothing particularly new about identity and identity politics. But the way that we intervene in that is strategic, tactical. It takes identity and configures it in temporary ways in order to build alliances. In the demonstrations outside the Hilton Hotel on Tuesday, for example, we were shouting things like, "In our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians." Now, of course, it was patently untrue. Many of the participants were not Palestinians. Some of them were Jewish activists, active, supporting the Palestinians and chanting that as an identity statement in order to mobilize people for that moment, for that particular issue. So I think we need to put the focus exactly where it should be, on social media and the personalization, the psychologization of politics in that sphere, and the way that that feeds over and frames other kinds of politics. We need to acknowledge that there is a de-emphasis on identity in much cultural practice, not an obsession with identity at all. And we need to recognize that strategic essentialism, which underpins a lot of the activity of the left and the feminist and anti-racist movements today, is an opportunity for configuring identities in a certain kind of way for practical purposes. It's not about fixation on identity as such at all.
Yeah, it is true that a lot of the discussion that I've seen, kind of arguments that have arisen from the book, have been about identity politics, And, so you would think that I took a very hard line in a way about identity politics, which I actually don't. I think that, if you think, in the clearest possible way, what is identity politics? It's a group of people organizing themselves because of the politics bit, organizing themselves along the lines of a particular identity because that group is being targeted in some way, or they feel that the things that they want to address in their lives are best done through organizing within that group. And so the goal of any, identity politics movement in its early stage is to create consciousness within that group, so that people will think of themselves first and foremost as a member of that group, rather than, their national identity, for example, or or maybe their class or whatever it might be. That in a particular historical moment, it calls for thinking of yourself as part of that identity group. So I think to some extent, it feels almost slightly pointless in a way talking about it in the abstract, because I kind of feel like it's an almost inevitable product of circumstances. Like, people don't just randomly choose to start identifying themselves as part of one group. They usually do so because they have been discriminated against, or something has happened to make people think of themselves in that way. And the other problem is, in a lot of the online sort of fights that have been going on in recent years, that there's always a dichotomy between class and identity politics. And people who are very class-oriented are always very frustrated by the way in which identity politics tends to dominate. But I often think, just to use a kind of weird example that people normally don't associate with these arguments, the north of Ireland is a kind of interesting case, right? Because Marxists desperately wanted people in the north to realize that they had this, these class interests in common, and to forget about the identity questions that obsessed them in a way. And that just didn't work. So, no matter how much you might be able to make the case for having done that, it's not something that people felt. They didn't really believe or feel that their lives would be improved through the politics of class. They felt that they needed to band together with those who were in their identity group. While you can make the case for it in abstract, identity politics kind of moves people on a level that almost nothing else can. It's very meaningful to people, and it's not necessarily a rational thing. And the things that give people's lives meaning, I think sometimes if you approach with kind of either abstract ideas or kind of the material stuff, it just doesn't necessarily move people in the same kind of way. And so, you can argue for it, but it won't necessarily work, in other words. So, solidarity, for example, like, if you could say the abortion issue, right? Obviously, the restriction of abortion by the state, gives a kind of a material kind of cause for women to band together and to fight for this particular issue. Now, you could say, but what about the fact that in polls, men are actually slightly more pro-choice than women? Or you could say, isn't abortion a moral issue? Or you could approach it as an entirely abstract issue. But that isn't how it works. It is an abstract issue, and it is true that women are not necessarily pro-choice and all of that stuff. But the way that people experience politics, it just doesn't. It ends up being women banding together, being forced to, in order to, change the political system in ways that they feel will benefit their lives. So I kind of am very conflicted about this issue, to be honest, because on the one hand, I would say the best thing that could possibly happen right now, and I'm really hoping it will, certainly in Dublin, I don't know what the situation is here, but in Dublin we have a really terrible rent crisis, and a lot of major cities have this now, which has made living very, very difficult. More than half of the average take-home pay in Dublin is spent on rent. I would love for renters to organise themselves along those lines and the needs of renters are different from those of people who might have, for example, working class jobs, but they might have bought a house 30 years ago when you could actually do that, or whatever. So, in other words, if renters were to become conscious, if you like, as a group, it would be because material circumstances force them to. And I think, for me, that would be the best thing that would happen, and that would be across the lines of gender, sexuality, class, and so on, or race. So there are things where I think it would be great to, to transcend identity issues being absolutely primary and to focus more on these very, important immediate material needs that would require that kind of transcending those things. But another few years down the line, a different set of circumstances will produce a different kind of politics. Sometimes it will be identity politics, sometimes it will be something entirely material, sometimes it will be something more abstract. But in a way, I almost feel like we don't necessarily get to decide. It's almost like the history decides.
Yes, yes. So obviously that set the scene very nicely for a discussion. There's lots of disagreements amongst the panel that have already come out. Can see lots of people indicating already. I'm going to start on the left. I guess that's going to be popular. And work my way across. Maybe take 4 or 5 comments and then we'll take the panel back. So, yes.
Thanks. I'll try and be fairly brief. Going back onto the question of intersectionalism, I think I maybe slightly disagree with Angela's last point on this, as in I think you can be too fatalistic about this. And going on to Ian's point as well, I think that if we accept a definition of identity politics, which effectively encompasses everything, I think we lose an idea which is actually valuable in terms of analysing a particular form of politics. And I think that rather than this just being based around the inevitable use of some kind of cultural affinity to bind a group or a protest, I think identity politics specifically as a historical phenomenon is defined really with a sense of an other. There has to be a defined group and there's a limitation on that group of necessity which can't be overcome by simply shared beliefs, and that bounds that group together, and I think that's really what identity politics is. I think you can see early manifestations of that which aren't quite the same in the early liberation movements from sort of the 60s onwards, but actually identity politics I think started to actually form more solidly, because even in those early liberation movements there was a big strain amongst the Black Panthers, for example, to have white sections and to have other sort of areas where things transcended race. However, I think identity politics starts to move into a category where things become very much centred around particular interest groups. And just going on to the question of intersectionality and the history of the development of intersectionality, I think is useful in the context of this discussion, because as I understand it, intersectionality as a term was coined in the 80s, and it was basically a kind of a fairly bog standard criticism of liberal feminism. As in, nothing new, the idea was, okay, so liberal feminists say that all women are united by this, but that's not really true because a white middle-class woman in New York doesn't really have the same lived experience as a working-class black woman in New York. It's like, okay, yeah, fair enough, that's a fair point, everyone agrees. Everyone's already agreed, apart from a small number of middle-class liberal feminists who never agreed. Everyone else has always agreed. The vast canon of Marxist feminism, which has existed for a whole century before, always agreed. Everybody always thought that. So although it's kind of annoying that it was presented as a new thing, it's also kind of nothing to write home about. What I think was problematic about that was that actually intersectionalism became used as an organisational principle, so devoid of the rest of the context around that. The concept that actually the individual unique intersections of experience which everybody has individually are now the most important thing. And I see that, to try and wrap this up, I see that as actually completely the opposite of the point of the left historically, which is a focus on solidarity. So the concept of feminism was never supposed to say all women have the same experience. The point of feminism was to say there are some universal female experiences which bind the experiences of women, and on those issues women should unite together and fight collectively. Intersectionalism, just as a point, so I'm really sorry, Hilary. Intersectionalism, just as a point. completely puts the opposite focus on that and says that actually the most important things here are the things which identify people individually, not the things which bring people together.
Thank you. Lady at the front. Lady at the front here.
Lady at front, yeah.
And then can I give this other one out as well? Then we can
Yeah.
get people. So do you want to take the back?
I'm not going to speak as long as that. I feel so strongly about this, I'm not quite sure where to start. But of course we're bound by things other than our immediate identity. I'm going to be really cheesy and just say a poem. So you remember the poem, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist, etc., etc. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. I'm just going to add a chapter to that, which is, then they came for the old white men who are not very good at fumbling around at the Christmas party and making passes at women. And there was nobody left to really be rational about what it is that's actually going on around identity and identifying who is the enemy here.
Hello. I don't know your name, but I think you're awesome, and I think you're very brave, so I commend you for that. I tend to agree with a lot of what you said about the impending doom of too much identity politics, but would you agree there are some good points, like gay people gathering together to get more rights for, you know, we've got Pride and all that, it's awesome stuff. So where do you draw the line between what's, if anything, if you think anything good compared to the potentially really bad?
Thank you. Then we'll come forward.
In 2007, I was president of the University and College Union, and we used to say, you know, we're the biggest post-compulsory union in the world, and it had a sense of solidarity and power. But in response to something that Ian said, I think that what connects people today is often their emotions and feelings of vulnerability and feelings of being a victim. You know, you said people write about this, I've written about it, other people in this room have. And if you see yourself just as vulnerable and nothing else, you know, the University College Union is obsessed by bullying. Right? All our people are bullied. They're all weak. They can't do anything. We need to protect them. So if you've got any collective that's based on vulnerability, right, on people's feelings of vulnerability, not real vulnerability, but they feel vulnerable, then you're not going to achieve anything with those groups. Because what somebody who feels vulnerable needs is more and more stroking, more and more therapy, more and more safe spaces, rather than any resilience to challenge things. And I think that's the fundamental thing. We do have an identity, but it's the identity of a vulnerable individual.
Okay, going to take this guy here, and then we're going to go back to the panel for comments.
Who?
Can you pass that one?
I feel I might be paraphrasing the guy who was speaking over there
Do it quickly, then.
very eloquently. Okay, I'll do it quicker than he did. So this kind of opposition of this kind of quite absolutist opposition of a universalist solidarity kind of model to something more identitarian. It seems to me that the problem here isn't identity politics. If we take identity politics as shared experience, as the possibility for some kind of affiliation in order to enact change, right? It's not that at all. The problem is the marriage of that with individualism. And I think I'm kind of channeling the guy on the other side of the room. Anyway.
Thank you. So we'll take the panel back for quick comments now, and then we'll come back in.
Thank you, some great comments. God, I think we're a bit down on people. I think maybe Angela, you're slightly in danger of arguing that we're driven by, you know, someone said fatalism, our emotions, what we kind of emotionally connect with in relation to our identity, rather than actually, I think I'd put forward the argument that most people, and especially in relation to politics, and especially in relation to liberation politics, or politics that are arguing for a freedom like the women's liberation movement or the gay liberation movement, or anti-racist movements, is not centred around the emotional feeling of being a woman. It's centred around the political demand for freedom, which is actually a rational thing. It it is as valid a man arguing for women's freedom as a woman arguing for women's freedom. I think that's a controversial thing to say today, but it really shouldn't be, because if we're ever going to get to a point, which I think probably a lot of people in this room share the opinion that we don't want to be divided and we don't want to be defined by things that we don't choose necessarily, although some of that's up for question now, but in relation to where we're born, who we are, we want to define ourselves by what we do and say. And in relation to the positive things about identity politics, because that was a very good point, obviously, it would be crass to say that abortion was raised as an issue. That affects women because women get pregnant, okay? That's a women's issue, fine. But arguing for women's bodily autonomy, which is a moral question, it is a moral question, arguing for women's freedom and women's equality is not necessarily intrinsically about the female gender, it's not necessarily intrinsically about the biology of what happens with pregnancy, it's about arguing for a very universal idea that every human being on this planet should be equal, and yes, that's abstract, but I mean, are we not meant to have some principles? Are principles always abstract? No. But I think in getting caught up in identity politics, in the personal is political, in what, my very being is so important to what I am, to my political being, what we're getting lost at, we're losing a sense of what you want. You're not putting out into the world your arguments, you're taking inwards, you're focusing inwards, you're being shallow. I'm going to go really hard on this. I think I'm probably the only one on the panel who's going to go hard on it. I think identity politics is largely trash. Today, anyway, it completely blocks any kind of positive political movement when you have somebody saying, oh, yes, but you can't talk to me about this because you don't look or sound like me. Well, I mean, Christ, what are we meant to do? Are we all sort of going to go in our corners in a room and not talk to each other? I feel like it's getting to that place, and it really angers me, as you can tell.
Just first of all, on the thing about feelings, I don't understand why feelings should necessarily lead us into talking about victims and vulnerability. That isn't what feelings are about. We have feelings about politics, which are very passionate feelings, different feelings for each of us. We're drawn into politics on the basis of feelings of solidarity, feelings of anger, feelings of rage, feelings of contempt for those with power, a desire to overthrow this wretched political economic system and find a different way of living together. Those are feelings as well. It's not necessarily to do with victimization at all. And it's very sad when you raise the question of feelings that the gut response is suddenly, it's to do with victims. Everyone must be a victim whenever they talk about feelings. It's not the case at all. Secondly, the thing about intersectionality is really a straw concept being put up here. People think, because start wailing that intersectionality includes the word sectionality. Therefore, it must be a collection of different sectionalities. The word also includes the word sect, but that doesn't mean that intersectionality is about sects. Intersectionality is precisely about working at the connection point between different identities, not in identity as such, but in the way that identities have been formed and between different identities. There's as much about intersectionality, which is questioning and dissolving and transforming of identity, as there is about identity as such in intersectionality politics. Now, there's a number of problems that we need to face, and those problems include, for example, the resentment of an old left that was fixated on unitary proletarian identity as the only salvation force in the world, and is angered and enraged by the emergence of a multiplicity of different social movements around race and sex and gender and sexuality and so on and so forth, disability and so on and so forth, enraged by these different identities that they can't comprehend and they see as fragmenting the unitary proletarian subject. It's that rage of the old left at this new dispersion of identity that is part of the problem, not the identity as such. There's a fantasy about identity politics at work here, which is more powerful than the identity politics itself that is being caricatured.
All right, I think sometimes when we have the conversation about identity politics, we're actually it's a shorthand for something else, which is actually the particular behavior of or styles of contemporary identity politics. So we're not actually talking about identity politics itself, we're talking about the behaviors that we witness now, right? So Ella, when you talk about the examples of people saying you can't speak on this issue because you're not a member of this particular identity group, I hate that stuff as well. I really, truly hate it. And I don't like the way in which contemporary identity politics is expressing itself in lots of ways. I guess what I'm trying to get at is more, like if you think of, is a civil rights movement identity politics or universalist? Because in a way it's universalist, right, because it's civil rights, but in reality it often is, it takes the form of identity politics is what I'm trying to say, because it's a group that are excluded from those civil rights. So like there isn't a dividing line absolutely between one or the other. So I don't know, I just wonder if there's a way of, like the intersectional thing, for example, I think one of the frustrations people feel with that is the sense that instead of even grouping together in large identity groups, people are identifying with so many different identity groups at the same time that it almost has the feeling of an individualization of identity politics. But I just think that the way in which universalist ideas can express themselves in actual movements looks like identity politics, or at least it's an identity group organizing together. That's kind of what I meant.
And what you mentioned earlier about identity and etc. being very shallow and etc. I think we've come to this moment because for the very first time through, as I mentioned earlier, social media, people have the opportunity to find people like them, to see people and meet people who have gone through the same experiences as them, and that's in a way finding a haven, or in a way finding sanctuary within that kind of identity, with that identification with that person. Do you know what I mean? So it's not a surprise when people are very overprotective about their identity and say, oh, you can't speak on this, you can't speak on that, because in many ways of course, for many years, like they'll say, you've not gone through what we've gone through, so why should you? But I think naturally over time that will become stagnant and it will implode, and they'll look outside that circle of identity politics. They'll look outside it and realize that the things that we're talking about, let's talk to other people about, let's invite other people into these spaces that we've created as a sanctuary for ourselves. And I think that's a process of metamorphosis where people are going through, that groups and identity groups are going to be going through anyway. So I don't think it's something that we should be worried about. I think it's just with time, as people find a sanctuary and realize that, yes, we can let other people from different experiences come in and tell us about their experiences for us to learn collectively. I think once we get to that time, everything's going to be all right, and people are not going to be as shallow as now at the same time. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Can I see hands again? If you right at the back, put your hands up really high. I'm going to take people who have not spoken first. If you're in the corners, you might even need to light your blooming iPhone torches or something so I can see, because it's very dark out there. A little bit brighter would be good. Yeah. So, front here, and then somebody over there.
Where was, you got the front, yeah?
Yeah. So this front first.
Okay, yeah, Ian, you just said that identity politics is essentially a straw man and a fantasy. Yet, in your opening remarks, you said essentialism is an opportunity to reconfigure identity for practical purposes. So therefore, it's both a fantasy, but it's a real thing for practical purpose. Now, even if that was the case, which I don't believe it is, doesn't that still risk reifying identity? Wouldn't it risk becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy if people embraced identity for those practical purposes, that it reinforces that identity? When do you snap out of that identity?
Thank you. So you pass that one to the back, and then there's somebody over there.
Yeah, I've not really got a problem with identity politics, but someone alluded to the civil rights movement a minute ago. And I think there's a good character who illustrates a lot of this. So it's the difference between Malcolm X when he was shit and Malcolm X when he wasn't shit. So when he was in the Nation of Islam and he was advocating, yeah, and he was saying people need to keep themselves separate, and you had like mad things like Muhammad Ali meeting up with the Ku Klux Klan and saying, right, we shouldn't get together and all that sort of stuff. And then he left the Nation of Islam and then said, all right, no, we all need to fight together. We got like a shared interest, and he became like a lot more socialist. And I think he came around to it in the end. But that idea that identity movement should keep themselves separate, it's just it's madness, isn't it?
Yeah. I was just wondering if one of the most important factors in how it's played out today is that there's a profound loss of faith in wider social change. So if you like, in the past, when I first got involved in working class politics, it wasn't because I thought there was anything great about being working class. I thought it was pretty shitty. We were going to die earlier with the worst housing, we didn't have much money. The whole idea was to transform society and in the process abolish the class system. So it wasn't that we loved our identity, it was maybe a strategy, but to transform society. And I think some of the early forms of identity politics had that. The strategic essentialism was strategic. I think what's happened is with that loss of any faith in wider political change, the parameters have narrowed, and whereas the personal was for political outlook, now the personal has become personal. And that's why now if you criticise someone's identity, it's almost taken as an attack in the integrity of their self, very much taken as a personal attack. And I think one of the other problems with today is what we haven't touched on, with all this attack seen as a threat to the self, what identity politics has done, it's allowed the state to reposition itself as a neutral referee between competing identity claims. So now the state, where it used to be seen as a problem, we had to overthrow the state was problematic. Now, often, we turn to the state to protect us. So if you think about it, a lot of the things about protecting identities have come about, they're actually we've given more power to the state, we've given more power to employers. Sort of codes of conduct, anti-discriminatory policies at work have actually been turned against workers, and now the employers have got far more powers to discipline the workforce than they ever had, and that's all done in the name of the fragile identities that we have today.
I think that a lot of what Angela said about behaviour being the most important thing in our attitude towards identity politics is really important. So, for example, for me, it's the difference between the politics of liberation and the politics of identity. The politics of liberation can manifest itself as Fred Hampton and the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party organizing with working class white men, with Latinos, and with indigenous people against a common enemy that was capital, whereas the politics of identity can manifest itself as a black daughter of a UN ambassador telling white people that they can't go to a Black Lives Matter rally in Manchester. So really, it's based on the nature of our behavior and whether we use our identity as a weapon. It's whether we weaponize it. And if we weaponize it, then it makes our politics both lazy and it diminishes solidarity, which is like the most important thing. I just want to challenge just Ian's point about the old left and their obsession with universal proletariat. I think that really diminishes a lot of work that the old left made, a lot of strides that the old left made over decades of international solidarity, whether it was Dockers, standing against apartheid in South Africa. And I think that the politics of identity has essentially implied that all of that work was meaningless because they didn't recognize identity at the time. So to say that the old left are part of the problem, I disagree. I think it's these tumbler wankers. Thanks.
I've got two mics, so you
Give
can
me
have
one.
that one. Yeah.
Hang on.
You promised last time. I only promised halfway through last time.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back because I felt like some of Ian's response was partially directed to me, and I thought that it was unfair to say that I'd ever made an argument about the inclusion of the word sectional and sectionality in the term intersectionality, because that's not the argument I made. And ironically, that in fact is a straw man, because nobody else has made the argument in the room. And also secondarily, I also do personally take umbrage at the idea that I am so enraged at people finally being concerned about racism and sexism, and that's the real reason that I have an opposition to these. The reality is, my opposition is built in painful experience of being a left-wing activist over the past more than decade, where I have witnessed the quality of debate and discussions get reduced. I always use this as an analogy, but I once wrote an article about the destruction of the short-lived International Socialist Network, which was a group which was founded on intersectionist principles, and within the space of a year destroyed itself over an argument about whether or not race play in the kink scene was a subversion of oppression, whether or not it was actually oppression itself, or whether or not, and they couldn't have this argument in a rational debate without basically using the identities of the different people involved in the discussion as a weapon against each other, and effectively destroyed the organisation as a result. And that, for me, is a metaphor of the kind of conversations and the kind of attitudes which I have seen played out and got more and more severe over the past decade on the left. And it's the actual organisational reaction that I see towards this problem, which is the foundation of my opposition to identity politics and nothing else.
Okay. No taking umbrage, anybody, please. So I'm going to take the panel back briefly, then I'll come out and still lots of people want to speak.
Okay, just to clarify, what I mean by the old left is not the history of the working class movement and the left organizations, which I think we should have respect for and build upon. I don't mean that. I mean the old left who are remaining today, looking back at those old struggles, who are unable now to connect with the new social movements, unable to connect with the new forms of resistance to imperialism, to capitalism. That's what I mean by old left. It's quite a specific problem that I'm pointing to there. I agree with Ken that top-down definitions of identity are extremely problematic, and I would draw a contrast between those bureaucratic ways of defining identity which do divide people and separate them so that resources can be allocated and policies can be formulated. I'd differentiate that from resistance identities which are formed in struggle, temporary, strategic, and are for specific political goals.
Angela can go.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to kind of echo what Charlie was just saying and go back to the feeling that I have that we seem to be talking about identity politics, but we're really talking about certain types of behavior that we now associate with identity politics, or maybe even that are the logical conclusion of it, or just an inevitable part of it, that maybe you can't have identity politics without it ending up at what it is now. But certainly it's been, I think it's been the same. I think it's been a terrible influence. It's been incredibly divisive. It has really empowered people who want to be divisive and who are in politics solely to be divisive, who are absolutely poisonous characters who want to destroy movements. They have used it really well to do that. But my problem is I can't get from there to saying, therefore identity politics is meaningless or pointless or something like that, you know? I can see that it has a role. I can see that there are certain historical moments where people are forced to think of themselves as a group because they have to defend themselves as a group. But it is also true that the contemporary manifestation of identity politics is really toxic and negative.
Just like you've just mentioned, how it could be toxic and negative and there's benefits to it. In regards to identity politics, I think it's always going to prevail somewhere, somehow, in some form or some place, naturally, without whether we like it or not. Because people look for identity within themselves. They always want to survive, and it's a survival mechanism as well to find identity within a group or somewhere else at the same time, whether we like it or not. Just like, for example, when you walk for example, down Curry Mile, everybody's together because they identify something as collectively. It's political in some way. It can be defined as political. They might not call it political, but that's the way they can identify themselves due common language, due common religion, due common food, for example. It kind of tells you that, as I said earlier, how it's just going to prevail regardless. And with people identifying themselves in those certain ways, backlashes come with that. There's always opposition to no matter what it is you do, or no matter what it is you kind of believe in or identify yourself with. So I think it's quite broad. Then when you talk about identity politics, I think it can apply to so many different things at the same time. So yeah.
I think we're potentially in danger of getting a little bit confused in relation to identity politics. So, like, is it that you are a woman? Is it that you want to hang out with other women? No, identity politics is something quite specific. It is the focusing of your political beliefs on your identity in a way in which the phrase "the personal is political," but it becomes intrinsic to your political belief, and to the exclusion of other people who aren't of that identity. So it isn't just wanting to hang out with other people who look like you or come from the same area as you or have that kind of same identity as you. It's about saying that you want to organize politics on the basis of identity, which necessitates the fact that men can't talk about women's issues, that white people can't talk about black people's issues, or gay and straight. That is what identity politics means. That is what it's being talked about today. I think, okay, so there's a lot of lefty activists in the room, which is great. But let's think about what this means for people who don't identify strongly with the left anymore, or who aren't in these kind of sort of little bubbles discussing the ins and outs of what intersectionality means, which is largely a boring conversation. It's a boring idea. But what does it look like if you're kind of watching and trying to get interested in politics, and you're just an ordinary person, and someone says to you, well, you can't talk to me about women's issues because you're a guy, and you can't talk to me about you can't talk to me about pride, and you can't talk to me about the fact that or abortion is still illegal, or that gay people still get homophobic abuse because you're a white working class guy, and what would you know about anyone's experience? That is the most isolating and the most damaging thing to do to politics. And, we had solidarity, the word solidarity, dumbed down a bit. I think kind of, that's an important word, and it's an important idea. The idea that I've said it, and I'll say it again, the idea that it doesn't matter what your identity is, it matters what you identify with. It matters the politics that you identify with. You could be a Martian, and if you're going to come on the march with me for, women's liberation, then come join me. When did that become a controversial idea? When did that become something that we had to pontificate over? And I think it happened over a long period of politics turning inwards. And I mean, that's what I meant by shallow. Turning inwards, focusing on you, yourself, me, myself, and I, rather than looking out to who I can talk to, who I can organize with, who I can argue with. That's what identity politics is. It's not just about, who your friends are, which is important, but completely personal. It's about what you're doing in the political realm, which is not personal. It's, it's social, it's public, it's out there.
Thank you. Don't feel you can't argue back, though. We've only people disagree with that. So I know there's two people want to speak in the front row here. Can I see other hands, just so we know where we're going after that? Okay.
So I've sort of got to disagree with Ella a little bit. When you talk about sort of solidarity as being, obviously I do agree solidarity is very important, and you want to be there for ideas and stuff, but I think part of identity politics was sort of born out of the lack of solidarity that was shown towards groups within sort of social movements. So say when you think of the Occupy Wall Street movement as a huge social movement, one of the striking things that I sort of read about it was that women that were stood there out on the streets supporting this movement were groped, and when they stood up and spoke about it, they were booed and were told to go away. And then that's when women's liberation sort of started developing more. And then the same again with black women that were sort of said their problems aren't as important, their sort of issues aren't as important as the massive struggle of women's liberation. And so that section sort of stemmed off itself. The same with gay women. And I agree absolutely that I hate the sort of, you can't talk about this because you're this. Obviously, that's complete rubbish. But I think to completely dismiss identity politics based on these overarching ideas, it sort of almost puts the sort of tone of what should be talked about in the hands of the already sort of powerful sort of groups in those things. And like, it's all okay as long as you are there for like the big group, but the big group don't have to be there for the smaller groups. I think that's what the problem is when people say they don't like identity politics. If that makes sense.
Good. And there's somebody next to you, behind you, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So it kind of ties to what you were saying about men can't talk about feminism issues. So say that you've got a feminist movement that is about like the sort of moral, universal matters of feminism, and not only about like the women's experience of like abortion rights and things. Do you think there's some sort of symbolic value behind giving only women the sort of, like making only women the public face of that movement? So like having women speaking at the events and sort of making the men be sort of the background of that movement. Do you think there is some sort of symbolic value to that?
Okay, thank you. And then backwards.
I think there's a strange, I'm feeling anyway, there's a strange displacement of political discussion in the whole event. And I think this actually springs from the idea of identity politics, which is a product, is a symptom of a certain political malaise. And in a sense, we've walked into it. There's all these people who are advocates of identity politics, but we've walked into it by engaging with them at that level, at the discussion of identity. Because it seems to me, you know, when people in the old left used to talk about class, they always talked about class as if it wasn't an identity. You know, me being gay was an identity, but them being working class was not an identity. I mean, so there is this difficulty, it seems to me, in this whole discussion, where we're not focusing, we're addressing a symptom of a certain malaise, rather than the nature of our political crisis, our political and democratic crisis, which is basically, we don't know what's bloody well going on, and we don't know what to do about it. Right? And in a sense, if we could focus our discussion on that, I think Kwame's point that he made earlier, that identity politics is likely to dissolve in the fullness of time, is probably true. If we were able to fashion a path and a way of talking about the political problems and circumstances that we face, if we were able to do that, then this the whole question of identity politics and all sorts of nonsenses that go on and are associated with it were likely to dissolve.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give this one over here, and then can that one go over to the lady at the front? But we'll take this guy first.
Hi. I just to say my position, I think the kind of absolutist terms in which an identity politics is seen as sapping the possibility of work based on kind of universalist ideas. I kind of think this is a caricature while I agree that it does manifest in particular behaviours by particular people and particular groups, and it's certainly very evident online, I think in my practical day-to-day experience, I mercifully have very little contact with it, yeah? Right, that's the first thing to say. But I want to ask the panel, each of you, can shared experience be the basis for affirmative political action? And, right, if we assume that that shared experience is based on empathy, can sympathy not align people with it? Yeah? Sympathy as distinct, feeling for rather than feeling as. Yeah?
Right. I think we do have shared experience, of course we do, but the problem is I think this identity politics moves against that shared experience all the time. It's trying to separate us. I think it seems that we're forgetting the whole of history. I don't believe that social media is the first chance to connect with each other through some sort of solidarity. We're forgetting the whole of history to think that social media is our first chance to connect with people. And I suppose I just want to simply ask the panel, in terms of civil rights in 2017, because again, we know the history, this is going back decades, hundreds of years. Who is losing out today, and is it any different?
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to take the panel back, and I'm going to come out. That might be your last chance the next time we come out to make contributions. So be having a think if you want to speak and gathering your thoughts ready for that. So.
Sorry, what was your question again? I caught one part of it, but not the first part.
Empathy is the basis of affiliation based on shared experience. Sympathy is something else.
I think first and most, it's really about creating platforms and opportunity to talk about those experiences first and most. Just like I mentioned earlier, how like I think the idea of identity politics, of the part where we don't let other people speak because they've not been through what we've been through. I think over time, when we start opening the doors and getting together more, I think through more of a natural way, not just through social media, that even touches on something else where, to the extent where we're going to have to go backwards towards more of an old school of communication and actually talking to each other face to face about our experiences and etc. I think when groups start doing that more, I think people will have more of an understanding and more of a connection with different groups and etc. And I think that's when that's when a mass character can kind of build, once we start opening those doors and start looking from a broader perspective at the same time. I think that's, once we start doing that, I think that's a path on positive change.
Your question was a long one, but it was a good one, actually, because I think what a lot of the time, identity politics, in the way that it plays out, it becomes pity politics. So actually, it's not about changing anything. It's not about making any social change. It's about recognizing and sympathizing with somebody's personal grievance, which is to the detriment of any kind of social movement. So I don't argue against racism because I pity black people or sympathize with black people when they face injustice. It's because I can put myself in that position through solidarity with feeling that injustice and wanting as much their freedom as I do my own. That's the difference. Of course, shared experience is the basis for a lot of people's engagement in politics. You don't just get political with it dropping out the sky and you think, oh, I want to argue for everyone's freedom, let's go with it. No, it happens because things happen to you and you talk to other people and your experience of the world forms what you think. That's that's actually the antithesis of identity politics, because what identity politics tells you is this thing that you can't change, right? That I was born a white woman, well, but this thing that I largely can't change, is going to be the defining factor of what I think. It has to be the basis of every argument I make. And that is, all I can do then is ask other people to sympathize with me. All I can do is say, believe me, it's really hard being a woman, sympathize with me. But if I want to get beyond that, in which I'm saying, this is why I think identity politics is so damaging, is because in order to get beyond that, you have to say that you leave your identity at the door, and then you move on to what you identify with, your political ideas. There is a difference there. We are missing it. Identity is important because we're human beings, Who you think you are is an important thing. It's something that is enjoyable. It can be something that you very much enjoy sharing with. I like the fact that my family is Irish. I have a good time with them. That forms sort of like part of my politics. But it certainly doesn't act as a defining, thing of who my political being is. That's the difference. And there is a difference between sympathy and empathy. I'm glad you raised it.
No. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say, I'm sorry, Charlie, I didn't mean to attack you. I actually meant to attack. Actually meant to attack Ella. Having said that, I agree with what Ella has just said about shared experience. I think her answer was very good. And I think that it doesn't actually mean that we need to be against identity, because what we hear when people are declaring their identity and mobilizing is we're hearing their right to speak about who they are and their forms of solidarity with other people. There's something in a declaration of identity in a paradoxical way, which is also a declaration of universality. And that universality can be made practical, made manifest in the solidarity that we build with different people who are declaring their identity when faced with exploitation or oppression. I think Don's point about a symptom is really apposite here, because what is a symptom but a conflict between a desire to speak of something on the one hand and an attempt to shut it down and suppress it on the other hand. That's what a symptom is. And that's what we have at play here in this kind of discussion, where we have Ella bringing in the black bin bag kind moments where she refers to horror stories about people not being able to speak because they're a certain category of person. And yes, okay, maybe we've been in those situations ourselves, but they're really quite rare and they're not really part of mainstream radical politics. No. Oh, yes. Yes, that's right. You take your politics from what you hear on the news. That's part of the problem, Ella. That's exactly part of the problem. If you look at the way that politics plays out in practice, for example, in the terrible, terrible Me Too movement, which you referred to earlier, what happened in the Me Too movement is you had an opportunity for women to speak about their experience of oppression and harassment. When Kevin Spacey was attacked, when Kevin Spacey was accused, and he tried to cover up the accusation and to deflect the accusation by coming out at the same time, suddenly that identity claim became a problem. Things are much more fluid and complex, actually. And what Kevin Spacey then did, unintentionally, was to open the way for the question of abuse and harassment to be including young men at the hands of older men, powerful men as well. The universal came to the fore in that very process.
I was having a conversation about these questions, the kind of bit where I feel, maybe I'm being terribly pedantic, but I kind of feel like I'm stuck at a certain point because I can see the problems with contemporary identity politics, but I still can't quite say it makes sense to say the whole thing is meaningless, because people are forced into a circumstance where they have to defend themselves as a group at certain moments. If you're a very small, ethnic minority or whatever it might be. But anyway, my friend who I was talking to, I said, can you give me an example of an identity movement that's actually a universalist movement? He said the gay rights movement. But I mean, if you look at that, a very vital component of it was also pride, right? Which was entirely an identity movement. It was specifically saying that this, as a group, we're defining ourselves as a group, and we're going to have essentially a kind of, along with, or maybe to make possible a political movement, we're also going to have a kind of cultural or identity movement, which is about pride and which will break the taboo of homosexuality and so on. So again, I mean, just about any movement I can think of that is an identity movement has some universalist claim or aim and feel that they have been excluded from that universality, but it is a form of identity politics. I mean, if you think of, for example, something like, I'm trying to think of a particularly small kind of embattled group, but like, say, Travellers in Ireland, or maybe like Roma Gypsies or something like that. It doesn't make any sense to say to people who find themselves disliked and a very small group, oh, well, you should think about politics in a more universal way, or, you shouldn't be engaging in identity politics. I mean, for some people at particular historical moments, it's kind of a matter of survival to group together. And that doesn't always involve just a pure, universal claim. It usually involves some kind of a pride movement or a cultural revivalist movement or something like that to give kind of energy and pride and strength to the particular group who are trying to defend themselves.
Okay, so sorry if this question isn't very well formatted, I just sort of thought it off the top of my head. So there's been like a lot of talk around, obviously universalism versus like multitudinalism, and basically what you're arguing, for want of a better word, the idea that there's a multitude of different identities and it's about the combined force of those is a positive force for change, versus we need a universalist political idea or a human idea, and that's the conflict here. What I'm trying to pose here is it possibly the case that the reason we've seen a breakdown of that universalist idea, you referred to it as the proletarian identity earlier, is the fact that as society's changed and we've seen, the emergence of a much less rigid class structure with a much larger middle class and all this sort of thing, that traditional collective identity based on just being brutally oppressed by capitalism has broken down. And in that case, what is the basis for a progressive collective struggle that isn't based on either a proletarian identity or one purely on sort of like an ego or experientially based identity? What can we move towards, essentially?
Keep that mic over there.
I'm just wondering, we're talking a lot about identity politics here, and it seems quite, on sort of stuff that I would consider related to what we've seen in student campuses in recent years, issues of identity related to gender, sexuality and race. I'm wondering, for me, I mean, probably the biggest identity movement, I suppose, historically is nationalism, really, in terms of how people identify with their nationality. And I think that's something that's quite important today. If you think about Scottish independence, you think about Catalonia, I think Brexit, there were certainly issues of national identity related to that. And I think it's a real problem, particularly in Europe. And I think we can link that as well to Trump in America in certain respects. So I'd be interested to know, I mean, we're talking about nationalism here. It's very, long-term identitarian politics as far as I can see. So I'd be interested for the panel's thoughts on that.
Okay, anybody got any final questions? Last chance. Oh, Dan, sorry, didn't see you there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking there just seems to be a contradiction in that the less racism, sexism and homophobia there are in society, the more people identify according to these identity categories. So it doesn't seem that the identity politics is derived from any experience of discrimination. And do you agree that that is the case, that it's not derived from the experience of discrimination? You know, and if it isn't, what is behind this embrace to identity? Is it does the embrace an identity? Is it a case of experience leading to identity, or is it a case of an identity in search of an experience?
Okay, anybody else? Oh, right over here. That's a bit awkward.
Right over there, yeah.
Right at the back there. Sorry, you're going to have to climb your way through.
Sorry.
Hi. This in answer to that last point there, I would reckon that people would get perhaps more confident to express their identity within certain societies, perhaps if there was less of it around. And also just to make the point that often the reason why people use their identities within a wider social group is because it's a protected characteristic which gets extra compensation for lack of power. Obvious point.
Okay. Back to the back here, and that will be our final comment, and then we'll go back to the panel.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name, even though I'm a... Yeah, no, not you, you idiot. You. Yeah, sorry, I don't know your name. Ella, forgive me. A couple of people have compared identity politics, or called it cultural Marxism, about setting oppressor classes, and it's just another form of Marxism, but a cultural thing. I wonder what you thought of that analysis, if you'd heard of it, and how much exactly you disagreed with it.
Okay, right, so we're going to go back to the panel now for their final thoughts. You've got a minute or so each, maybe a minute and a half. We start at that end. No, you don't want to start? Who wants to start?
A lot of questions, a lot of comments. In the sense of you mentioning about universally about what's the next step, it's quite broad. I think it's really, I'm really going to have to touch on and really say that the question on what the next step is you probably have to see in what the issues within your identity group in a way. Do you know what I mean? I think that would be kind of a place to look, like the groups that everybody identifies with various different groups. I think it's very important to see where the issues lie in those groups as well, to see whether there might be a commonality between one group and the other, to kind of expand on that, and for it to become, for example, a mass thing. Because if we're looking for it to be a mass thing, because mass character creates mass change in that sense, and I think it's important that through our connections and the people that we identify with, that we kind of look and search for the issues that are still not being overturned today, and turn over the stones haven't been turned today. Like, for example, on our campuses, how a lot of students are taking a lot of pride in our identity of, for example, being gay or being black and disabled and etc. But there's still a lot of, especially within bureaucracy and the politics that we see on TV, not just the local politics, but the top politics that we see on TV, we still don't see the reality of politics on TV. It's still very centralized around a certain group of people consistently for many, many years. And I think if we work together to kind of empower those political groups to get involved and politically kind of influence those channels, I think that's where we can kind of start see that kind of the change over there. To what you said in regards to, where's the gentleman gone? Oh, there you are. In the sense of chasing experience. In the sense of chasing experience, I think that just is part of growing up as well. I think as we grow up, we want to experience different things. We want to find ourselves in a way. And I think if we see someone who's experienced someone, you want to know what that's like. Not necessarily that you want to go through the things that they've gone through, but you want to have that knowledge of what they've been through, and kind of show that kind of empathy with it at the same time. And I think that's what I think a lot of people pursue.
That was a really good point that was made there about the fact that we do live in a much, if you think back to 50 years ago. We live in a much freer society. The liberation movements of the past made very good gains in relation to freeing up women in terms of fighting racism and discrimination and homophobia. We live in a society where certainly in the UK, where people feel much more free to speak out about their identity, to not feel hampered by their identity. And yet we are increasingly, I think, encouraging people to feel constrained by their identity. It's a kind of strange paradox in which it matters less and less your gender, less and less it affects your life experience, and yet you're supposed to care more and more about it. There's something in that which I think really hasn't been tackled, that kind of fact that we are more constrained today by identity, arguably, than perhaps we were in the past, or certainly we're more obsessed with it, I think. But just to kind of end on a sort of upbeat point, having said that identity politics is trash, which was a bold statement to make, it's obvious that our identity is crucial to us. We wouldn't be human beings if it wasn't. It's intrinsic to who we are. I was kind of... You're not very good with glasses, are you? Gosh. You kind of, when you're watching the telly, you see all these programs like "Who Do You Think You Are?" and there's an interesting. We're always going to be interested in pinpointing our identity and saying this is who I am, and I'm confident in it, and that's something very positive. But if you're talking about changing the world, and if you're talking about moving politics further, I think you'd be much better to look outside of yourself. Look at the big issues that people are facing today, like housing, the economy, democracy in relation to Brexit. These things are not intrinsic to any identity. They are universal ideas. They are big political ideas. I think most people would be much more interested in talking about that than looking inside themselves.
Oh, right. As I said at the beginning, I think there is a problem with the psychologization of politics and the reduction of politics to individuals and to personal responses to things. But I think we have to find a way through this. Instead of attacking people who declare their identities, we need to work with those identities in order to enlarge the sphere of political debate so that we include many, many, many different experiences in our political struggle. If we look back to the Russian Revolution in 1917, for example, that was a revolution which saw a flourishing of different kinds of identity and different transformations of gender and the family and sexuality. It's a model of, in some ways, of the kind of movement that we should be building today. Stalinism, which became identified with the bureaucracy as a worldview and turned Marxism into a kind of science, was itself obsessed with a certain kind of identity, whereas the revolutionary movement itself was a dispersed variety of different identities that in the process of struggle actually unraveled identity itself and enabled the emergence of a universal movement for liberation and solidarity. It's that universal movement for liberation and solidarity that we should be building today, working with the different kinds of oppressed and exploited who are speaking about their specific experiences of life in this wretched political economic system.
Okay, well, I started by saying, kind of talking about how at particular moments, historical and material circumstances make it, allow identity groups or to kind of form, they where they need to defend themselves and so on. But I do think right now, so as I say, I can't entirely throw out identity politics for all the reasons I've said, but I do think the circumstances that we are in right now do call for a decline in identity politics being the primary kind of political paradigm, and getting back to the fact that it's not going to be any good if we continue to have stagnant wages and worse and worse kind of living conditions if women are having an equally bad time as men. It's not going to be any good if we have equal sort of polling and figures in terms of like men and women and different ethnic groups if everything is actually getting worse. And the only way to make those material things improve is some kind of solidarity that transcends those things.
Okay, thank you. Can we thank our speakers, please? And thank you for what was, I think, a really good discussion. So thank you for all the contributions. Can we also thank Interact for the organisation tonight, Will and Ben?